Everyone, how's it going? Welcome to chapter 27. We're going to be talking about more imperialism. I know, you're like, what? We're still on imperialism? Imperialism is not just a one-hit thing. It was a movement, you know? It started with the British, and we talked about this amazing example of the British in India and, you know, what an overwhelming example that was. But the thing is that imperialism went on for several centuries, and it was felt everywhere, okay? And so we're going to continue with this discussion of imperialism today, and we're going to look at another example of it with China and how it affected China. We're going to talk about it in Japan. We're going to talk about its impact in also in the Ottoman Empire a little bit today. So our major focus will be really China, a little bit about Japan, and a little bit about the Ottoman. Okay. Now, just to revisit, what is imperialism? Does anybody remember what imperialism means? What was that definition? Anybody remember? The domination of one country over another politically, economically, culturally. So if your life or society was a pie, right, and you broke it up into three parts, political, economic, cultural would basically break up the whole pie, right? Political, that's rule, laws, currency, your way of being, right? Economic, your way of making money, your markets, you know, and then culture, that's religion, language, customs. Imperialism overtakes all of that. It's rule, it's trade, it's currency, it's language, it's culture, it's religion. It's every aspect or area of life is influenced in some way, shape, or form. Okay? And this is what imperialism did. And Westernization, European countries did this. Now we're going to continue again with kind of Britain being the example of this imperialism. All right? So let's dive back in. If you have your questions, I would grab those. The date range for this chapter, we're about 1800 to 1870. Geographic location, because we're talking about China, Japan, and the Ottoman. We're definitely in Asia, Turkey, Middle East. Key civilizations: China with the Qing dynasty, Japan, and the Ottoman would definitely be the big three key civilizations that you'll want to have. I won't cover every question in the questions, you know, per usual, but I will definitely be touching on some of those questions. So I would have them there so that you can hopefully, you know, get some of those done. All right, so let's get started. Imperialism in China leading up to 1914, which does anybody know what started in 1914? What big world event? Oh, there was a hint. World War I, okay? So this kind of takes us up to World War I. The Qing dynasty falls after World War I in 1914, all right? And when I say holds on, that's really what it was, okay? The Qing dynasty exists during imperialism, but it really is this slow decline, all right? So what did China look like? China was being picked apart, basically, economically picked apart. So even though the Qing were there politically, economically, China was being imperialistically destroyed, okay? Picked apart piece by piece by piece. And it really started with trade. Now, if we rewind, what were the problems facing China? Well, for a while, they seemed to be okay, you know? When the Qing came into power in the 1640s, right, they reopened trade. They really tried to repair their road systems. Remember, they had one trade port. You may remember the name of that trade port, Canton, right? And the British tried to change this trade relationship. The British, the Dutch, the French, everybody sent representatives, right, and tried to renegotiate this trade relationship. Remember, Canton was very limited. One port, only half the year really that outsiders could visit. They couldn't leave the port. Remember, what was the one thing that the Chinese wanted in exchange for their goods? Silver, and only silver. There was some Silk Road trade, but sea trade really had become the way to do it. It was much more efficient. You know, the speed with which they could do it. It was cheaper to do it that way. And when the Macartney incident, the Lord Macartney incident failed in 1793, it was really just a matter of time before the Chinese were going to realize that their days of being in charge of trade were numbered, okay? Part of the problem is that the Chinese underestimated who they were dealing with. You have to understand, when they went into isolation, right, during the Ming, no one was better than them. But when they came out of isolation, little did they realize that Europeans had surpassed them in technology, in military superiority, in seafaring technology. And so when the British came demanding, what the Chinese didn't understand is that they refused them, but if it actually came to warfare, they couldn't defeat the British. They couldn't defeat Europeans. Prior to the 1800s, they placed very strict limitations, as we talked about with Canton, only silver. You know, it was really, they had the upper hand. They didn't take the British seriously as a threat, or really any European as a threat. They thought because the British were so far away, that they were so distant, that there was, no chance. Oh, that's European problems. That's the Americas problems. Nothing, none of that can touch us. They really felt inferior to the problem. China loved the trade surplus. They were exporting more than they were importing. They were getting all that silver. But Westerners were tired of the trade deficit, and they weren't going to put up with it much longer. And so quickly after the Macartney incident in 1793, the British go about changing the tides. So how do they do that? Well, China was having a lot of internal problems. By the 1800s, their efforts to bring about change weren't really, it was like putting a band-aid on an infection. It's really not helping. It covers up how it looks, but it doesn't mean there isn't an infection underneath. They were having economic issues. They were collecting their taxes in silver, and the reality was that most people couldn't pay their taxes in silver. The irrigation, there was overpopulation issues. Irrigation systems and canals were poorly maintained. Leaders, there was a lot of flooding, so this led to poor crop production, and then lack of food. Widespread corruption, in officials, and so peasants didn't trust them, so they would pay taxes, and then those taxes wouldn't get turned over, and then people would be accused of not paying their taxes, and these people, like, we paid our taxes. It's the typical, why do empires fall? It's rarely one thing. It's rarely just outside invasion. It's often internal problems, lack of military, that make them susceptible to outside invasion. So it's not just that the British were going to be able to overpower them. It's that they were having a lot of internal problems as well. The civil service exam was being rocked by bribery, scandals, people who, let's be honest, lining the pocketbooks of certain politicians, and so-and-so was getting through and other people weren't. And so it had lost its reputation. It had lost its credibility. It's like an election. If people don't believe it's fair, people have no faith in the system. If people don't believe that the civil service exam is fair, people lose faith in the system. This is going to lead to our first drug wars, you guys, our first official drug wars. Now, I'm sure there have been wars over drugs before, but our first official drug wars. Now, when we think of drug wars, we like to think of, like, I don't know about you, we like to think of, the cartel, like, I don't know, the stereotypical, Miami Vice, or, Colombia cartel or Mexican cartel. You know what I mean? Like, kind of stereotypical, and then, the last 30, 40 years of things going on, smuggling into the United States or something like that, okay? Well, let me tell you, the first major drug cartel, the Queen of England, all right? And she was smuggling opium from India into China. Okay, so if you look at a map of China, which if I go back, then I'll mess up my recording, but if you look at a map of China where India is, okay, it was easy for them, well, I should say easy, location-wise, they were growing, opium is grown through poppy plants, poppy seeds, okay, so they were growing fields and fields, mass productions of opium, which was used common as a painkiller. Well, when taken in mass, you become drug addicted, okay, and so what they were doing is they were growing it in India, and they were producing it, breaking it down so they could distribute it like a drug dealer, and they were smuggling it over the western borders of China, which were poorly protected because the Qing was falling apart, and they were selling it to the peasants. Now, if you were smart and you were the British, how would you demand that the peasants pay for the opium? What had you wanted to stop paying to the Chinese? Think about it for a second. It starts with an S. You guessed it, silver! They started smuggling opium over the borders of western borders of China and into the seaports, wherever they could get it in, from India. Because India was you have to understand, India was called the crown jewel of Britain because it was their most productive colony for raw goods. Okay? And then because it was such close proximity to China, they start smuggling in opium as fast as they can get it. It's close proximity, so they're just chucking it in there, all right? The Chinese people are buying it like crazy, which means that the British are getting silver like crazy. So two things start to happen in China. First, if you are taking drugs, think about the stereotype of someone who's addicted to drugs. If you're addicted to drugs, what are you not doing? You're not being a productive member of society, right? Because you're high, you're strung out. So peasants become rampantly addicted to drugs and become less productive. So less productive in the fields, less productive in their businesses, less productive on their farms. So this becomes a massive problem. Second, when the tax collectors come around to collect taxes, how are peasants supposed to pay their taxes? Oh, silver. Guess what the people didn't have? I'm not making this up. Silver. Why? Because they've been paying it to who? They're British drug lords. This is so true. Okay? So the British are like, oh, you won't trade with us? Okay, then we're going to smuggle drugs into your country. Oh, you won't give us silver? Okay, then we're going to demand that your people pay us in silver. So the Chinese go around to start getting their silver for their taxes, and their peasants are, one, not being productive, so their economy is declining, which further perpetuates their economic problems, and two, I mean, it's not funny, but it's just hilarious how this is like becomes this political game. You know what I mean? You're just like, are you kidding me? No, I'm not kidding you. They start smuggling in drugs and then taking out the silver. It's like, where there's a will, there's a way, right? And the British are going to have this. Well, of course, now, the Chinese are like, you better stop. This is not okay. Opium imports are banned. This is absolutely not okay. But they couldn't enforce it because they didn't have the military, they didn't have the infrastructure to enforce it. And the British had such infrastructure that they were able to smuggle it in. It's like having a border but no border patrol. You know what I mean? Like, people are just going to come over the border then. There's nothing to really enforce it. So in 1839, due to the increase in these problems, the Qin actually started to try to enforce it. Well, the British obviously didn't like this. They considered this enforcement a restraint, an assault on their economic well-being. Well, you can empathize with the Chinese going, hey, dude, like, we need our people, one, to not be addicted to drugs, and two, you're taking all of our silver. The British are like, well, we want a trade relationship, and you won't trade with us, and we want silver. So both sides dig in their heels. Boom, opium wars, drug wars. Okay? Yes. Now, the Chinese thought they were going to win, but you have to understand, they were fighting with older technology. They were fighting with older ships, with older weapons. They were more traditional. The British had the biggest, baddest navy, weapons, modernization in the world. And so for the Chinese, this is when they underestimated the British, and it really went to their disadvantage. And all this time, out of sight, out of mind, oh, that's a threat, that doesn't affect me, is going to really play against them, right? And they will lose the Opium Wars, okay? So from 1839 to 1842, we have the first drug wars, the Opium Wars between the British and the Chinese. Why did the British do this? The British want trade. Why? They want tea. They want porcelain. China was the gold mine of trade, and they want to trade with them. And they don't just want to buy the products, they want a mutual trade because there's a lot of money to be made. So what's the result of this? China is now forced or pushed into submission of imperialism, okay, with the Treaty of Nanking. Now, this treaty is something you want to remember. This treaty really sets up China for the next century, their decline for the next century, okay, through World War I, World War II, and why they are opposed to us during the Cold War. So let me repeat that. The Treaty of Nanking is something you want to remember because it sets up their role of oppression during imperialism. It sets up their struggle during World War I and World War II, and it sets up why they are on the opposite side of the West, when I mean West, of democracy during the Cold War. This rivalry and this sour taste comes from this, okay? So here's the treaty from this. It was very much an unequal treaty, and here's what happened, okay? It forced them to open up trade to the British, French, Germany, Russia, Japan. Basically, anyone who wanted to come in. This picture really says it all, okay? Here's China. Everybody gets to sit down and have a piece except the Chinese, okay? Britain, of course, is going to receive the largest piece. Okay, you see the Queen of England there holding the knife, all right, to Russia saying, we get what we want, okay? were in charge here. So China has to pay indemnity to Britain, basically debt. So the British get the Chinese addicted to drugs. The Chinese say, stop getting us addicted to drugs. They go to war, and now the Chinese have to pay the British for the cost of the war, for getting their people addicted to drugs. That's pretty messed up, right? But this is what the Chinese said. Okay, so, or this is what the British said. So, first, the Chinese have to open their borders to trade. Second, the British get the biggest or the best slice of that trade, okay? So the Chinese had to open up about 6 different ports. So they went from 1 port, Canton, to about 6 ports. So I would make note of this, okay? Second, Britain gets kind of first choice of these ports and what's to be traded. So products and timing and all that kind of stuff. So what's to be traded, timing of trade and things like that. They definitely get the first slice of the pie because they won the Opium Wars. So from 1 port to like 6, 7 ports, Britain gets first, head of the line, okay, first choice of the buffet of trade, so to speak. China now has to pay Britain for the cost of the drug wars. It's pretty messed up, right? So now they're hugely in debt to the British. Now they have to equally trade. The Chinese have to buy from the British, open up their ports. The British get first choice of trade, and now they have to buy from Britain as well. British have rights to residence in these ports. So now they can leave the ports and they can live in the ports. Okay, they have these treaty ports that they've opened up, okay? And they're granted what's called extraterritoriality, all right? So any of these British who are living in these treaty ports, these extra ports that have now been opened, basically are not subject to Chinese law, they're subject to British law. So let's say that I'm living in Canton, a Chinese port, okay? But I'm a British citizen. And let's say that I steal. That's against the law in China. You can't steal. Okay. Well, the Chinese cannot arrest me and hold me under Chinese law. They have to turn me into British officials, and then it's up to Britain whether or not they prosecute me. Now, yeah, it's against the law in Britain to also steal, but let's be real. Are they really going to care that I steal in China? Probably not. Okay. So extraterritoriality is basically going to be this free pass for British living in China to do what they want, and they can't be held accountable. It's kind of like how have you ever heard like diplomatic immunity? How diplomats can't be held accountable within the country of those laws. They get immunity. It's kind of that concept, but it's really messed up. Okay, and then Hong Kong is a colony of the British until 1997. So Hong Kong has been going through the last 20 years a slow transition back into Chinese control. And we've seen a lot of protesting and rioting in Hong Kong because they're used to a democratic society, which China is a communist society, right? So over the last 20 years, as Hong Kong is slowly being passed back to China's control, China is slowly oppressing the rights of Hong Kong. And this is why a lot of the people in Hong Kong are protesting, because they are used to Western standards of government. They are used to democratic standards of government. They're used to freedom of speech, vote, you know what I mean? Free and fair elections, no censorship or limited censorship. Do you know what I mean? There's always censorship, but limited censorship. And in China, there's a lot of censorship. There is no freedom of speech. They are communist. And this is part of the reason that Hong Kong, we have seen such uprising and revolution and protesting, because they are being oppressed or being restricted back toward Chinese rule, which is not typical of what they're used to under British rule. They're used to a different type of government. So what did this lead to within China? Well, it was pure decline. Okay, the Taiping Rebellion is going to happen shortly after the Treaty of Nanking. The people of China felt like they had basically been abandoned by their government, like they'd ratted them out. Like, how could you do this to us? How could you sign this treaty? How could you just open our doors and just let the British in, let them have whatever you wanted? There's a lot of pride for the Chinese, and this was a first for them. They're not used to being the losers, so to speak. They're used to being the winners. They're used to having to say. And so the people of China, the peasants of China, did not take this well. The mandate of heaven's not looking good, and the people are really not doing well with this, okay? And a rebellion will start. There was even a Christian movement. Some might say, what? A Christian movement? Okay. It was led by, I always say this name wrong, so please forgive me, okay? So it's Hong Ochuan, okay? Ochuan. And so he was a leader of one of these movements that started the Taiping Rebellion, all right? And This is what he proclaimed. He saw himself as the younger brother of Jesus. Yes, let me restate that. Yes, he stated he was the younger brother of Jesus, and that they were destined to drive the Qin, which were the Manchurians, from China. Okay? Not everybody believed him, but some people believed him. All right? That yes, totally different region of the world. About 1800 years later, after the life of Jesus, but that he is the younger brother of Jesus, and he's been sent here to help drive out the Qin from China. So some people believed him and they followed him, and there was an uprising. Okay, so what strategy they used? They used different ethics, economic groups to fight against the Qin. Women became actually huge warriors of this movement. Why did people support this? Well, they supported it because they felt betrayed. The idea that the Qin would allow the British government any kind of control, opening up these ports. So even though their government was still in control, they were pawns. Basically, it was the Qin, the British say jump, the Qin say how high. So you might still be in charge, but you're a puppet government at this point. And the Chinese are proud. They're not used to this, and they felt like they had been betrayed, that this is beneath them, and they do not bow to Westerners. Now, for a while, the British stayed out of it and said, this is up to you. You figure it out. But the reality was this went on and on and on. And the Qin, not having a great military, were not able to suppress the rebellion. When you have massive fighting, especially civil war, which is what rebellions lead to, is become civil war, right? When your own people are fighting people, it turns into civil war. Economic production goes down, and the British didn't like this. The British are like, oh, this is not good. So at first they tried to stay out of it, but they realized over time they had to get involved, okay, or this was just going to completely ruin trade. So the British got involved and had to back the Qin. Otherwise, this Christian movement might actually win. So what was their reaction? Again, at first, they concluded that they weren't true Christians and that they weren't going to be a part of this. All right, they were like, this isn't our problem. We're not going to do anything. This is their issue. In fact, they were busy with the Crimean Wars, okay, going on in Europe. So they felt like they didn't have time to handle this. But once the Crimean Wars were wrapped up, then they turned their attention to this, because if this was going on, then they wouldn't be able to trade as much. So again, it's just, if there's political unrest, then economics go down. So it's not that they really wanted to help the Chinese, it's that they wanted the economics to go back up. Okay, so the quicker they can suppress this rebellion, then the better it can be. So they come in, they support the Qing, they help to tip the scales to suppress this, and I say this in quotes, Christian movement, okay, the younger brother of Jesus movement, and they suppress the rebellion, all right, to end the Taiping Rebellion. Make note of this. This is the bloodiest civil war in history. It is. It's the bloodiest civil war in history. They estimate between 20 and 30 million people died during this civil war. It is the bloodiest civil war in history. Between 20 and 30 million people died. That should say 1864, sorry, not 2864, okay? So with Europeans' help, the Taiping Rebellion was suppressed or ended in 1864. So this went on for 14 years. Very, very bloody, and they estimate between 20 and 30 million Chinese died. And it's really devastating. It's all the more devastating when you have civil war, because it's your own people dying, right? So it doesn't matter who's dying. It's all a loss. The victory is really short-sighted because there's not much victory. And on top of that, the British charged the Qing for all the costs to help them win and added it to the indemnity that they owed from the Nanking Treaty from the Opium Wars. So now the Qing were out 20 to 30 million people, 14 years of rebellion, and now even further in debt. So this further perpetuated the decline of the Qing. Here's an example of this imperialism, okay? You have two Qing representatives who traveled to the countryside in England to look at the Maxim guns, okay? This was a big moment for the English, and of course they wanted to capture this. This is a military picture, so taken by a military photographer, and they wanted to capture this because this is a big moment. You have to think, up to this point, the British go to England, or the British go to China for everything. Look at how the tables have turned. Who's coming to who now? it's kind of like, who's your dad? Look who's in charge now. Yeah, like this is a big bragging moment for the British. And this picture wasn't just about bragging to the British. This is about bragging to Europeans. Like, look at us. Yeah, the Chinese are coming to us now. This is an imperialistic statement, this picture. So yes, this picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So this picture shows the devastation of the Maxim gun, right? It sawed a tree in half. But this picture also is about showing, look, the Chinese are visiting us now. The Chinese come to us. We don't just go to them. They buy from us. They're in our turf in England buying from us. Look how far the imperialism comes. Look at how much the tables have turned from the failure of the McCartney incident. This picture really is worth 1,000 words and shows the imperialistic hand, the octopus, right, that we saw last chapter, that the Chinese have. The Qin continued to fall. The Taiping Rebellion ended in 1864, and then we have the Boxer Rebellion from 1899 to 1901. The Chinese are upset. They are upset they continue to be subject to foreigners, to foreign control, to foreign trade, and their response to Western influence in any way, shape, or form, and their influence is to rebel against their government. How dare you? They saw the Qing as weak, and they wanted someone else in control. And the British, basically, again, the British used the Qing as puppets, and the Chinese people weren't having it. So we have another rebellion where, again, more civil war and killing of their own people and fighting internally, and it just continues and continues and continues. They try to suppress this by writing a constitution, by forming a republic, but it all fails because the Chinese, at the end of the day, didn't want Westernization. They wanted independence from Westernization. And so every attempt of Westernization or influence of Westernization just continued on the rejection and the bitterness that will grow up through World War I, World War II, and then the Cold War, the total rejection of Westernization by turning to communism. There's nothing more anti-Western than communism, right? And that's what the Cold War will really become, communism versus anti-communism. And that's part of what drives them to that. So what's going on in Japan during all of this? Well, we talked about how Japan closed their borders. Japan closed their borders around the same time that the Ming did, okay? They closed their borders for different reasons. We had talked about they closed their borders because they had had a huge influx of Jesuits, Christian missionaries who were converting people in the 1500s, and they were afraid of having this Western influence and having rebellion. And so they closed their borders to outsiders in a very similar way that the Ming did to and I kind of say this in quotes, preserve their culture, preserve the outside influence. And so they closed their borders. They had one port open, and they would only allow government interaction with Europeans and trade, but no outside influence, no outside influence of any kind was allowed in. But during this time, they, like China, fell behind. They fell behind because of lack of trade, lack of interaction with the rest of the world, and modernization. And they saw from afar what was happening with China. They saw Canton. They saw the McCartney incident. They saw the Opium Wars. They saw the Treaty of Nanking. They saw the Taiping rebellions. They saw all these things. Now, Japan got lucky in that there was a lot of interest in China because they had so many resources. There wasn't as much interest in China. They didn't have as many resources. So Japan was lucky in that there really was very little interest in Japan until 1853. Commodore Perry of the U.S. Navy arrived at a port in Japan with a letter from the U.S. demanding that they open up a port. The U.S. interest in their port was not for internal trade. It was just typically for that, a refueling station. So Japan was lucky in that, one, Westerners did not have the same interest in Japan as they did in China because Japan didn't have the natural resources that China had. China was very large, had a lot of natural resources, a lot of raw goods, and so there was a lot of economic interest, so therefore reason to push imperialism. Japan, islands, arid, dry, subdivided, mountainous, not a lot of interest, imperial interest. What they were interested in, though, is a refueling station. So the first thing that Japan got lucky with is that there just wasn't a lot of interest in conquering Japan. What would you benefit from it? Other than, I conquered it, but for what reason? Second, Japan was watching from afar what was going on with China. China was resisting what was happening, and look at what was happening to China. They were losing. They lost the Opium Wars. Now they're subject to trade. Look at the Treaty of Nanking. Look at the Taiping Rebellion. Look at the Boxer Rebellion. Look at them falling time and time and time again, being subject to European imperialism. How do we not suffer that same fate? So, have you ever kind of heard if you can't beat them, join them? This is going to be the Japanese perspective. And this is why the Chinese, it's really this simple. The Chinese rejected, and therefore will struggle all through the 1900s, okay, until the Cold War. All through World War I, World War II, reject, struggle. The Japanese will take a different approach. They will decide to embrace the change, and I will show you how. Through this embrace, World War I, World War II, they will be a powerhouse. Why? Because they embrace westernization, modernization. They embrace the new age. So one, they got lucky. They got lucky. If there had been interest, then it doesn't matter if they had embraced it, they would have been toppled. So first, they got lucky that there wasn't interest, but second, they decided to embrace it instead of reject it. Okay? So when Commodore Perry arrived and said, open your borders, the Japanese said, okay. And then, instead of resisting modernization, they learned from the Chinese mistakes, learned from their adversaries across the way, and they went about modernizing, which was called the Meiji Restoration. So there's two keys to the success of the Japanese. Two reasons the Chinese struggled. One, massive interest in them, right? Europeans were interested in them because of their economic, resources. And second, they rejected westernization, so fall victim to it. Japanese got lucky for two reasons. One, no real outside interest in them, right? Because they didn't offer a lot of resources. And second, they decided to learn from the mistakes of from the Chinese and modernize. Okay, so they decided to restore a central monarchy to get rid of the shoguns. Okay, so to get rid of these military leaders and to actually restore power to a monarch. Okay, so because remember before, their monarch was basically just a puppet government, all right, who was more of a figurehead. And they actually decided to restore, call it the Meiji Restoration, to actually restore power to their monarch. Okay, a rich country, a strong military became their motto. Okay, they centralized an efficient government, so no more feudalism. They ended feudalism. They practiced feudalism during the Middle Ages, kind of like Europe, and they got rid of that. Centralized power, one political leader, and actually gave them power. And they started to do kind of what Russia did. They hired Westerners to come into their country and train them. Military, if you ever watched The Last Samurai, it's an older movie, but The Last Samurai with like Tom Cruise. I mean, it's a very Hollywood movie, but it is a very loose example of how they would hire Westerners to come and modernize them. It was one example. They opened factories. They joined the Industrial Revolution. They modernized their military. They did the things. So the same kind of things that Russia tried to do, they did the same kinds of things, except they did it better. Okay? They modernized their military. They modernized their economy. They modernized. Instead of fighting westernization, they joined westernization. They did this with education, the Industrial Revolution, with military, and within decades, Japan became a naval power. They became the #1 Asian country. They did. They even beat Russia in the Japanese-Russia War before World War I. An embarrassment to Russia, but a feather in the cap of the Japanese. When we get to World War I, they were the powerhouse of Asia. World War II, we'll talk about. They were a powerhouse of Asia, not China, Japan. Because the key, they modernized in the 1800s. They embraced westernization, setting them up for success in the first half of the 20th century, setting them up for success in World War I and World War II. China struggles in the first half of the 20th century. Why? Because of the rejection of westernization, because of the internal fighting leading up to the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion. This is why. So let's revisit our old friend, the sick old man. Okay, the sick old man. And I'm going to tell you the story. So depending on when you watch this, I'll tell you the sick old man story of the uncle. Okay, the sick old man story in our live session. All right, about my husband's uncle, the uncle that wouldn't die. All right, that always makes me think about the sick old man. All right, the Ottoman Empire gets the nickname the sick old man. Because they kept going. Remember, they go all the way back to the 1300s. They really officially became an empire in 1453, right, with the conquering of what? Constantinople, when it becomes Istanbul, right? They were one of the three major gunpowder empires. You had the Ottoman surrounding the Mediterranean. You had the Safavid, which is in present-day Iran, and then you had the Mughal, which is in India, which then the British will be a part of conquering during imperialism, right? With the BEIC, the British East India Company, and then eventually will directly control after the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, 1858, okay? The Ottoman Empire is kind of like the Qin in that they decline very slowly. That's why they get the nickname the sick old man. They will decline very, very slowly, okay? In fact, they last until after World War I until 1919, okay, is when they officially decline. In the early 1800s, they faced serious challenges, serious challenges. Part of their problem was nationalism, okay? They were multi-ethnic, okay? So they had many different people that they controlled with many different racial backgrounds, language backgrounds, religious backgrounds. And trying to control those people under one rule is going to cause a lot of internal fighting. And people didn't want it anymore. People didn't want to be under Islamic rule when they were Christian, or they were Jews, or they were a different sect of Islam. That people didn't want that, or different cultural groups, so maybe different languages or different ethnic backgrounds. And so you had a lot of nationalistic identities that triggered internal fighting. And the response to this led to suppression of this, and in such cases of like the Armenian genocide. Okay, the Ottoman tried to suppress these internal nationalistic movements, and in some cases killing mass groups of people who would speak against them, who would try to go up against them. So Europeans got involved. You know, they tried to help break apart. It was to their benefit if the Ottoman became weak. So Western Europe didn't like that the Ottoman were infringing on Eastern Europe. So Europeans helped, for instance, Greece and Serbia gain their independence and stuff. So in individual cases, because it's not that Europe wanted another independent country, but if they gained independence in Eastern Europe, it weakened the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so they didn't want to go to full war with the Ottoman, but by supporting the Serb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So by supporting the Serbs or by supporting Greece and helping them gain independence, it weakens the Ottoman. This was something that they tried to do. So what did the Ottoman try to do to hold on? Well, they try to restructure. They try a lot of different things to hold on, okay? They had to modernize. The Janissaries were a thing of the past. Remember, this is where they would take the Christians that were left from the Byzantine and they made them the main portion of their military. So they tried what was the Tanzimat restructuring, okay, where they tried to kind of get rid of the religious influence and tried to create equality, okay? So they tried to guarantee political rights based that all men were equal, okay, and get rid of religious influence. That all men had the right to a public trial, equal protection under the law, okay, despite your religion, because there was a lot of a religious preference if you were Muslim versus if you were Christian or Jew. And this caused a lot of internal fighting. So they tried to create more, you know, pure laws or pure structures that were more Western, right? Where there's lack of religion, right? So that religious preference is neutral, that there's no religion in law, that government is neutral, okay? That it doesn't have a religious preference. It's not the Islamic government or the Christian government or the Jewish government. It's just the government. And despite your religion, you are held accountable, okay? Not because of your religion, there's different accountability. They tried to institute education reforms, public education, new tax reforms, again, that all taxes would be equal for men. The Janissaries became a real issue because, again, this was based on the old ideas of Christians being a part of that, and this created a lot of internal issues. They tried to change the way that men dressed, so from robes to wearing pants, the type of shirts, to look more Western. So they really tried to Westernize. They really tried to take a Western approach to public trials, equal protection, freedom of speech, the way that the military presented themselves. What was the overall effect? Well, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a leak or putting duct tape on a leak on a pipe. It might slow down the leak, but the leak's still going to happen, okay? They did appear more European. It extended their rule, but it did not. It prolonged their rule, but it did not in the end bring about what they needed. The minority groups liked it, but the Islamic world didn't like it. They felt they were being betrayed. They felt that their morals and values were being abandoned, and this did not go over well. People who were very conservative Muslims did not like that Christians and Jews were being treated the same, that women were being liberated, that they were being meant to look more Western or to act more Western, that they were getting rid of their conservative religious values. And so this really led to a real mixed receiving. You know, on one hand, fitting in with the West would help them economically, but also led to a real rejection internally of people who felt that they were being betrayed, sellouts, cop-outs, you know, trying to fit in with the West. Also during this time, we had the Crimean Wars. This is by far the most bloody war of the 19th century, okay? And this is also considered one of the first modern wars of using guns and cannons because of the weapons that it's used. It was a very, very bloody war. This is a war where we can see Russia is rejected by Europeans. This was supposed to be a war between Russia and the Ottoman. Okay, so this is the war between Russia and the Ottoman, and they're fighting over warm water ports. They're fighting over areas around the Black Sea. Now, Russians were claiming that the reason they were doing it was to protect Christians, okay, Russian Orthodox Christians. And the Ottomans are claiming it was over land. Really, it was over warm water ports. Russians wanted more warm water ports around the Black Sea. Ottomans wanted, it was about trade. It was economics, okay? But the Russians were using Christianity as the excuse, as the reason to go into these areas. So really, Western Europe had no reason to get involved, but Britain and France did. Britain and France came to the rescue. Now, you would think, based on geography, the Ottoman are Middle East, they are Muslim. Russia is a part of Europe. They are Christian. They might not be Roman Catholic. They are Russian Orthodox, but they're Christian. So you would think based on geography and race and religion, who would you think that Britain and France would side with? Okay, you would think Russia, just looking at logic, right? They don't. They side with the Ottoman. They sided with the Ottoman, who normally speaking would be their enemy. Foreign territory. Think about it. Competitor in trade. Opposite religion. Enemy in religion. Religious sites. Any other day of the week, enemy. And yet you side with them. What does this tell you about how Western Europe feels about Russia? Remember how I talked about how Russia is the rejects of Europe? Here's part of the reason. Russia and Ottoman are fighting. Ottoman are losing. This is how much Britain and France, this is how much Western Europe hates Russia. They are willing, on any other day, their enemy, the Ottoman, to help the Ottoman defeat Russia, who technically speaking is European, is Christian, should be maybe not your best friend. It's like the distant cousin you don't really like, but they're a part of the family. You turned against them. You went against the family. But the British and the French do. The British and the French join the Ottoman and invade Russian territory to help the Ottoman defeat Russia. The Russians are defeated, pushed back, and the Ottoman are able to hold on to these territories in the Crimean War. This obviously is huge Super significant. Significant for two major reasons. Okay? One, it sends a huge political message. What's the message? It doesn't really send a message to the Ottoman, because as soon as it's over, the Ottoman know that Britain and France are not with them. Okay? So it sends a message. Okay? We did this not because we like you, it's because we don't like Russia. What's the political message? Russia, we don't like you. So remember how I talked about in chapter 22, like there's this, why is it that Russia always seems to be on the other side? Russia tried for a long time to fit in, and they're rejected. Remember I talked about the high school analogy, the cool kid table? Remember we had this conversation, okay? And when the cool kids turn on you and they reject you, here's an example of that. Britain and France turned on Russia, purposely sabotaged them. This is going to create some bitterness. This is going to create some big time bitterness. We're going to see more examples of it in World War I, World War II. I'm telling you, it's coming. All right? This doesn't just happen overnight. Okay? There's some big time bitterness where Russia's tried to fit in, and then Russia has explicitly been rejected. And here's an example of it. So this is the first big significance of the war. It draws a clear political boundary that Russia is not accepted by Western Europe. Clear boundary that Russia is not accepted by Western Europe. Second significance, okay, that we've transitioned to modern warfare. Trench warfare, machine guns, grenades, cannons, like Maxim cannons are outdated, but that modern machine guns, breech loading rifles, trench warfare, Maxim guns, these new type of weapons and their destruction. We see more death from this war than any other war, and it's because of these modern weapons, the destruction level that they can do in such a short period of time sets us up for a new type of war. It's considered the first modern war because of the new weapons, okay? And so two things really significant. The political lines that it draws in Europe that Russia clearly is not accepted and in fact rejected. And second, the modern technology that comes from it, okay? And this does prolong the life of the Ottoman, the sick old man, all right? And then I'll tell you in our live session the story of the sick old man in our family, and that I think will give you a little bit of a chuckle. Okay, so hope this helps. Hope you can see why China was set up for a struggle going into the 20th century. Why they struggle World War I, World War II is because, one, there was such economic interest in them, and they reject westernization and internally fight. Japan got lucky. Not a lot of internal interest because they don't have resources, but they embrace westernization and therefore modernize and then have a lot of success in the first half. So it really sets up Asia for two different paths. China for one path, Japan for one path, all in this last part of imperialism in 1850 to like kind of 1900. Okay? Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.